Okay. Morning, everybody. Friday, you see? Almost one. Yeah. Are you tired? No. You have the whole Sunday to rest, you know. Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for being here. Let me stay. Stefan? He left. Oh, he's here. Stefan, one thing.
Good morning.
Morning. We have to really be quiet. I mean, if you have a question, just raise your hand. You have to use the mic. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for Dr. Stefan to listen to you. Okay? But I'm sure you can listen perfectly. The sound is good. Here, Professor Stefan. Thank you very much for accepting to stay with us, even from far away. And it's a pleasure to have you here. And we have a very nice audience over here, people from 30 different countries, from Africa, Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, and the Americans actually, for many different parts of the world. So they have different backgrounds, people that works with social science and others with more exact science anyway. So I leave you for the class. You can start when you are ready, okay?
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me by now. Is that okay? Is the audio okay? Okay, good. Otherwise, you will miss all my jokes. I wish I could be with you in Brazil today, but unfortunately, I was not able to travel to contribute to this week. But I've been in contact with the organizers over the last month. And then I said maybe we can still do it via a video link. What I would like to do now is to share my screen, and then you will see the PowerPoint presentation. I will talk through it. Unfortunately, I will not be able to see if you raise your hand, but I don't have any problem if you interrupt me. So anytime you interrupt me, you will need to shout, or maybe the person in the front who is manipulating the computer, maybe he can or she can make sure that I see your question. So it's no problem interrupting me. I will do it in less than 1 hour, and I think important is also that you get some feedback and we can discuss. Yeah. So I'm sharing my screen. While doing that, my name is Stefan Uhlenbrook. I'm a professor of hydrology and also the director of the World Water Assessment Program, and that's based in Italy. And I will explain a bit what we are doing while I give my presentation. Wait a minute, view, share screen. Why does that? Wait a minute. Are you sharing this? Are you seeing the screen now? Good. Okay, good. I hope you see my presentation. It's entitled Societies and Economies, Vulnerability Related to Water Insecurity by Climate Change. I was assuming that over the last 4 days you have been discussing climate change at length. And therefore, I would like to now to give a little bit of different perspective and demonstrate that water and water availability is very key to the climate change adaptation discussion, as well as also very important for society and its vulnerability. Sorry, before I keep on going, do you also see that there's a little moving background, or is that the connection not good enough? Because I have a couple of videos. You can see, because there's a couple of videos and I hope you can see them. The basis of my presentation has been summarized in our 2 last reports. Every year the World Water Development Report is producing the World Water Development Report. And this is the 2016 report on water and jobs and the 2017 report on wastewater, the untapped resource. But before I go to that, I would like to set briefly the scene and say a little bit why I think that water is absolutely key for the economy, and particularly for a so-called circular economy. What do I mean with the circular economy? Well, maybe the current economic system is too much based on a linear economy. That means we extract some raw materials, some natural resources like water and metals and rocks and whatever. Then we manufacture something out of it. We distribute that to the consumer, and finally we use and dispose it. And in a circular economy, that's different. Huh? There we try to balance the economic growth with using and reusing the resources as much as we can and minimize waste. Instead of producing waste, we try to reuse and recycle as much as we can. So the advantages from a linear economy is to preserve the natural capital, the environmental capital, or even enhance it. Then to maintain the value of a product as long as possible. So if you use a pen or whatever, use it as much as you can. You know, don't use it once and throw it away. No, use it till it's not possible to use anymore. Therefore, you minimize waste. You have a lower carbon footprint. It's more resource efficient, and it's also shaping the value chain. And these are very important aspects. And I strongly believe that in the current economic system, if we will only follow a linear model, we will not be able to live in a sustainable way. And there's quite a number of benefits of that circular economy. And I really want to say it contributes to economic growth. It's not about reducing growth. And I know that many countries, and I understand many of you come from the so-called developing countries, which is a bit of funny terminology, huh? Developing countries. I hope that every country is a developing country. But you know, if you stop developing, that would be a bad sign. Huh? But I mean developing countries, southern countries, and obviously they need to grow economically. But in a circular economy, you try to balance that growth with the resource needs. And that is also good for cost savings, and it also creates jobs. And that's the next point I want to elaborate a little bit. But before I go into the jobs story, a few more things why I believe that the circular economy is so important. Here on this figure, you see the predicted resource availability for energy sources like oil, coal, and gas, and also for a couple of metals and other products. And what you see there, we are now in 2017. We have all of this still, but now here you see a picture of my youngest son, and when he has my age, so it's like in the late 40s, and that's in only less than 40 years from now, he will live in a world without oil, you know, maybe no gas, or just we are at the fringe of not having gas anymore, uranium the same, no lead, no indium for our cell phones, etc., etc. So he will live in a complete different world. So if we continue with our current consumption pattern, he will not be able to have this type of life we have and the products that make our life so good. Same is true for zinc, silver, gold, copper, etc., etc. So you see, the linear economy is not an option. Phosphorus is another aspect I would like to mention. Phosphorus is very essential for plant growth. Maybe some of you come from economics or a biological background, and I'm sure you agree. It's an essential element for growth of organic material. And depending on which prediction you follow, it probably will be exhausted in a couple of decades. And currently we use a lot of phosphorus for fertilizer. And it's also interesting to know that actually the vast majority comes from Morocco and the Western Sahara. And if you also add then China, Russia, and USA, then it's even more than 90% of the phosphorus comes from these countries. And the vast majority comes from Morocco and the Western Sahara, from that region. And not having phosphorus anymore is unthinkable in our current economy, because all our fertilization of plants depends on that. Therefore, we have to find other ways to work with phosphorus more in cycles than just in a linear way. Fortunately, the good news is that there's a lot of phosphorus in our wastewater. For instance, in the domestic wastewater, or like be clear, in the urine, there's a very high percentage of phosphorus that can be recycled and reused. So if we start on using our wastewater that we produce, we can diminish that problem quite significantly. And if you talk about circular economy, now I get to water. water is often forgotten. Many people think about circular economy, they talk about metals and plastics, other raw materials, but my argument, actually water is the absolute central component of the circular economy, because the water cycle is just, it's a cycle. So by definition, it's already in a cycle. We have, I'm sure you know from your high school education, the water cycle, which is illustrated on this simple figure, but it's by definition already cycling anyway. While any other product, you can maybe reuse it, and this plastic thing, you can maybe use it several times, drink out of plastic can, coffee not only once, but as long as it is good. Then you maybe can separate the waste and make something else, make a bench out of it or something else. But finally, it will be disposed and it cannot be reused anymore. So therefore, all this material is always a kind of a cradle to grave type of aspect, while water is naturally in a cycle. So it's a very natural component of the circular economy. Yeah. Is that clear so far? Any question on that before I move to the jobs component? Clear, good. Then these are some summary slides of why wastewater and water and wastewater is in the circular economy so important, but you can study that later. Let me come to my second point, and we talk about society vulnerability. And this is summarized on this one slide, and a colleague of mine took this picture in the southwest of the United States, and there was a very severe drought in 2-3 years ago. And there was really water shortage everywhere. And a farmer put out this sign, said, no water, no jobs, no potatoes, no kidding. We need water. Yeah. And that summarizes it all. Because if there's no water, there's not only no potatoes, no food, but there's also no jobs. You know? And that demonstrates the dependency of the economy also on water. Often it is referred to the agriculture-based economies. What you see here are two charts from Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, and you see the annual rainfall is directly correlated with the GDP, so with the economic growth of the country. If there is a good rain year in Zimbabwe, which was, the quality is a bit poor, this is the 80s, this is the 2000s. And you see if the rainfall is going down, the economy is going down. If the rainfall is going up, the economy is going up. And the same roughly is true for Ethiopia. These figures were shown by the World Bank some 8-9 years ago, and it shows economic growth really depends in agriculture-based economy on water. But is that only true for agricultural-based economies, or are there also other sectors that are highly water dependent? And that's what I would like to explain on this slide, that it's not only agriculture and forestry and fishery. Obviously, these three are very water dependent. Actually, these three together make up a third of the global workforce. But if you then also include energy, resource-intensive manufacturing, recycling, building, reuse, etc., so you see that more than half of the global workforce depends on having good water security. Yeah, and so it's much more than only the agricultural sector. In our 2016 report on water and jobs, we tried to estimate that at the job level, but this was very difficult. Therefore, you find this in the report. Everything is on our website, including my PowerPoint presentations. You can also find on the website. We did this more for sectors and came up with different assumptions. For instance, that 30% of industry jobs depend on water, 95% of agriculture, and 10% of services. And if you add that all up to the global workforce, you see that 42% globally actually are heavily water dependent of the jobs. 42. And if you add then the moderately water dependent jobs on industry, agriculture, etc., you see that another 36% of the jobs are actually, of the global workforce, is really moderately dependent on water. And if you add this all together, basically you see that 3 out of 4 jobs of the entire global workforce are water dependent. So in case you are working with water management, you have a very important role in your country. Yeah? Congratulations with that. Because the global workforce working in the water sector directly is maybe less than 1%. But the results of the management of the water really generates jobs for many of us. 3 out of 4 jobs globally are very water dependent. Yeah. Is that point clear? Any questions so far? Is that true for Brazil? What I'm saying here, what do you think? Sure, good. Yeah, obviously there's agriculture is also important in Brazil, but there's many more sectors in Brazil that are water dependent. And we say services, then it's also tourism, navigation and transportation and all these things, you know, have a given percentage, which is difficult to say exactly, but we made some assumptions and came out with this calculation. You see the water dependency. Okay, then let me move on to the next topic, which I would like to cover, and that's based on the report that we have published in 2017. It was launched 3 months ago, and that's on wastewater. And I know your main interest is climate change, but I argue that the impacts of climate change are, of course, due to the change in the weather and temperature and wind and radiation and whatever, but also very much felt through water. And if we need to adapt to a changing climate, then it has a lot to do with water management. And managing wastewater better is one of the central components here. So we published this report, and often wastewater is seen as a nuisance, you know, as a burden, something you want to get rid of, something you want to discharge to the environment and do not want to deal with it. But this report demonstrates that actually wastewater is not a nuisance; it's a resource. And that's maybe what I would like to illustrate in the next 20 minutes or so. This is a picture from the launch of the report. When we launched the report in South Africa, and you see here in the middle President Zuma, who is holding up the report, and the other people on this picture are different ministers from different African countries. And my boss from UNESCO is sitting here, and a senior representative of the World Bank, and that's myself. And I just want to show that when we launch these reports, we try to do that and reaching out to higher political level as well. And actually, our next report in 2018 will be launched in Brazil. Do you know that the World Water Forum is in Brasilia next March? Do you know that? The World Water Forum is the biggest water conference every 3 years, and it will be in Brasilia from 18 to 24 March or so. And we are planning to launch our 2018 report in Brasilia. So maybe I see some of you then there physically. And we also try to do that with a high level political show. And what are the main messages? Let me start in kind of reviewing some aspects of the world water resources. And again, only this topic, I'm supposed to talk at least for 2 hours, but then that would be a bit too much for you. So I really keep it to the focus on what is the status of the world water resources when it comes to wastewater. And when you look at it globally, and that might also be applying to your country, so in different extent, is that the water demand has been increasing every year by 1%. So every year we take 1% more out of the system. And always taking 1% out more of the system means also you generate more wastewater. Yeah? And what do we do with all this water? Globally, roughly 70% goes to agriculture, 20% either to industry or to energy production. And also there is a very high demand for the future, very rapid growth, particularly for industry water demand. And only 10% actually are used at households. The boy here cleaning the dishes, that's actually globally only 10% of the water. And what do you think is the part that we actually drink from all this water extraction? How many percent is that? Less than 1, yeah, much less than 1%. So much less than 1% of the water that we take out of the system, we actually use for drinking water purposes. And so it's actually negligible. So drinking less water doesn't save any water. Yeah? So don't do that. But obviously there's huge potential in trying to save water in the other uses, including households. But the efficiency of agricultural irrigation techniques is probably more important than certainly than drinking less water. Yeah, but I'm not saying we should not save water in the toilet and in the shower and etc. etc. But just on a global scale, this is a rather small number. Another driver for this global water resources is the increasing urbanization. In places like Latin America, already 75% or so live in urban areas, so it's a pretty urbanized society anyway. But still, it's still continuing to accelerate, certainly in Asia and in Africa, where the very large percentages of people live in an urban area, and that urban area is also growing rapidly. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, you see that the urban population growth is more than 4%, which is a lot per year. And you see the other growth as well. In people living in urban areas are not all living in very nice circumstances there, and actually a large percentage lives in informal settlements, in slums. You see here the percentages for different parts, the developing regions of the world, and it's on average maybe one third, but in some areas like Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, etc., it's sometimes more than half of the people living in urban areas living in slums. Yeah, I think you call that favelas in Brazil and other places. That's another main driver impacting water resources globally. If you then look at water scarcity, that's another issue that is increasing. That's also increasing because of climate change. Many places, as shown through statistical analysis of the past decades, the dry or semi-arid, arid places tend to become even drier, and many of the humid places even maybe are exposed to even more flooding or wetter. And becoming drier can also mean more flooding, because if the rainfall falls in different intensity, of course, that can have implications on the available water resources, which is not available because of flooding. Globally, already 2/3 of the world population experience water scarcity at least once a month. And here on this figure, there's many figures of this. Probably you have seen similar graphs during the last 4 days. And you see that the darker the color, the larger the number of months people experience water scarcity. So that means that the demand is larger than the supply. So they would like to have much more, but actually it's less available. And this is based on a grid scale estimation. You see in places like Brazil, I hope you can see my mouse here, you see some places there's no water scarcity, but that's also humid tropical areas and very densely populated. But in other places, the water scarcity, like for instance in the northeast or in the highly densely populated southern part, the water scarcity is already very, very significant in Brazil as well. What does that mean, water scarcity in terms of climate change? I said before that the historic record shows the so-called intensification or acceleration of the water cycle, and also many of the climate change models, which you have been studying over the last 4 days and will do next week, also indicate that climate change very likely, not everywhere and everywhere to the same extent, but on average they exacerbate the frequency of severe floods as well as droughts. So that's what I call the acceleration of the water cycle. I'm still in the kind of introduction to what are the global challenges, and I'm coming to wastewater now more intensively, but water scarcity is a point that I just want to make, because using wastewater can be very instrumental in offset the problems of water scarcity. So let me move to water quality. It has been degrading over the past years. Here you see many rivers of the world which are colored red. So they have quite severe pollution. Here it is given as coliform indications, which indicates the non-availability of wastewater treatment. And many of the orange and red rivers are polluted with this. And another example of this is the biological oxygen demand in streams. Also a comparison of two periods in the 90s and in the 2000s. And green doesn't mean green is everything is in order. It just means that the level is not increasing. But more even orange and red, and that means that the level of this BOD trend, or the biological oxygen demand in the stream concentration, has been increasing, which is yet another indicator for having untreated wastewater in the rivers. Yeah, so you see that wastewater is treated not sufficiently. Yeah, maybe I skipped this. So what we see is that when we extract more and more water, which I explained, every year we take yet another % more out of the system. At the same time, the water scarcity is increasing, and the water quality is decreasing. And so we have more wastewater than ever, and that is increasingly polluting our rivers. But why is wastewater why waste more wastewater than ever? I said that the water demand is increasing, but mind you, if we take water out, for instance, for agricultural consumption, I said 70% of the water demand goes to agriculture, and that's what you see here. But only 38% of that water is actually used consumptively, and 32%, roughly half of it, actually is used as agricultural drainage. So it's kind of discharging back as wastewater, often polluted, often with different temperature, different concentrations of different compounds. Same is true for the municipal water. Only a small percentage, 3%, is actually used consumptively, but 8% is actually discharged back to the environment. And industrial wastewater is the same. The vast majority of the industrial wastewater is discharged as wastewater. So globally, we produce more wastewater, and over 80%, so the vast majority of that wastewater is actually released to the environment without proper treatment. Yeah, so that's a very large percentage, and I can't give you the exact number because we found it very difficult to find reliable data sets. But globally, more than 80% of the water is going back to the environment without proper treatment. Yeah, so more than 80%. And in some developing countries, we saw statistics. There's basically no water collection and treatment at all. That means that basically all the wastewater that is generated is released to the environment without treatment. In some of the so-called developed countries, or the Western economies, you have some countries where more than 70% is collected and treated, which is good. But it's also in these places not 100%. Yeah. How is that in your country? What is the percentage? Can you tell me? Where's that? Sao Paulo. Okay. But there was a severe drought in Sao Paulo, and there was huge water shortages, and that went to the international news, and I'm sure you have been exposed to that as well. Imagine if the other half of the wastewater that Sao Paulo at the moment is not collecting and treating, if they would collect and treat it, they could reuse it. They could use it for different purposes. And that brings me now to my next agenda item. And that is related to human health and sanitation. Not collecting, not treating the water has huge health implications. And therefore also wastewater is often seen as a burden, because of the implications for environmental as well as human health. And this little video, I hope you were able to see the video. It demonstrates how disgusting the hygiene conditions are sometimes globally, in particular in slums. And what we look at the past years, and we have to say there is improvement. There is more access to improved sanitation during the so-called Millennium Development Goals period. And in some places in Brazil, it is estimated that the access to improved sanitation is almost 90%, between 76 and 90%. Many of the industrialized countries have close to 100% access to sanitation. Yeah. But there's also many other places that are yellow and orange. Orange means less than 50% of the population have access. In numbers, that means 2.4 billion people do not have access to improved sanitation. Almost a billion of the people actually have to practice open defecation. Because they don't have access to toilets. So what else can they do? They do their business out in the open. And this has huge implication. And for instance, if I always like this comparison with an aeroplane. You know, do you know how many people fit into a big aeroplane? One of these big machines? What do you think? How many hundred people fit into an aeroplane? 300. Good. Let's say 300. Every day, ladies and gentlemen, every single day, more than 3 of these big aeroplanes crash and fall down because all these 3 aeroplanes are full of children under 5 because of poor sanitation and the lack of hand washing facilities. Yeah. So if one aeroplane crashes, immediately makes it to the news and it's terrible and it's a disaster. But every single day, more than 1,000 children die just because of poor sanitation and poor hygiene conditions, and they're not able to wash their hands. You know, if you look at these numbers that some people also call the silent tsunami, that's a fact that doesn't make it to the frontline news anymore. But it is very serious. You know, these problems are tremendous. Yeah. Maybe less catastrophic, like drastic in terms of one airplane falling down and then everybody is worried and aware. But every day, more than 3 of these airplanes crash every day, full of children. Therefore, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is an exciting agenda. It also puts one of the targets of SDG 6. SDG 6 is the water and sanitation goal. And it talks about halving the proportion of untreated wastewater and really substantially increase the recycling and reuse of wastewater. So that's a good objective, a good target, and by 2030 we have to reach that. So that's working more on this. Really, you meet the globally, you contribute to the globally agreed Sustainable Development Agenda. What does that mean? Because it's nice to put these numbers out, but that would mean that in low-income countries, the least developed countries, on average, only 8% of the wastewater is treated. That means you have to go from 92 to 46%. Or in high-income countries, some 30% of the wastewater is treated, and that means you have to go to 15%. That would mean major investments, and I will come to these investments later on. And we also have to think, if so much investments are needed, what is the most effective way of doing these investments? Now, let me come to the third part. I totally have 4 parts, so I need another like 10 minutes or so. But whenever you have a question, you feel free to ask, please. Huh? And now, how do we meet this challenge? Well, it's the right objective. But how do we do this? How do we really significantly improve our wastewater management? And this is the answer. We have to reduce the wastewater generation. We have to remove contamination out of the wastewater, and that's we do by collecting and treating it. Number 3, we have to reuse the water for after some treatment. And finally, we have to recover also other interesting byproducts out of the water. But let me explain these 4 points. And in a nutshell, it's illustrated here. What we really need is a shift in the perception. It's a shift in the mindset that wastewater is not a burden; it is a valuable resource. And let me start with the reducing. Reducing a problem or preventing a problem is always much cheaper than trying to solve it later. So if you live as healthy, then it's always much better than to live unhealthy and to get sick and try to cure that later. So that's very simple. So when I talk to water is that we try to prevent wastewater generation by minimizing the water use in general. Yeah. So take a shorter shower, use more efficient agricultural irrigation techniques, etc. And second, we should ban all sorts of material that we put into the wastewater, which only pollutes, and partly that cannot be treated or hardly be treated anyway, yeah? Or it's too expensive. So trying to prevent is always much less expensive than solving the problem later. That means we should ban maybe some of the chemicals, some of the pharmaceutical materials that we discharge into the wastewater, microplastics, etc., etc. Second point. We should, if we generate wastewater, and we will always generate, almost every human activity somehow generates wastewater. Yeah. So then we should collect the wastewater and treat it. Yeah, we could treat it in an engineered system, in an expensive wastewater treatment system. That could be the right solution, or we utilize more natural systems. And we in our report we talk about one example from Brazil where it was shown that actually it's cheaper to use simplified sewage treatment possibilities than always the big high-end engineering systems. But is the high-end engineering system, maybe here in the picture on the left-hand side, is that always more expensive or not? And it really depends on the local circumstances. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of a decentralized wastewater treatment system on a small neighborhood in Germany. And this is actually wastewater treatment plant, what you see there. Huh? It's maybe difficult to see, but sometimes these decentralized systems are more cost-effective, because often more than half of the costs of the system go into collecting the water and distributing it. So if you have many decentralized systems, it can be more efficient than having one big system. But on the other hand, if you want to treat and recapture some of the good material in the wastewater, maybe then a centralized system is better. So it really depends on the objectives and the local circumstances. What we should not forget is that also the environment is a wastewater treatment system. Huh? And we can, through engineering the environment, like in this case, these are wastewater treatment ponds, the nature does the job. And there's also quite a number of examples in the report where you see how natural wastewater treatment can really treat water very efficiently. Good. This was reusing and removing. Let me move on to reusing the water. We can reuse the water for quite a number of different purposes, for instance, for irrigation or for aquifer recharge. Industrial processes, we can have so-called zero liquid discharge processes in industry, etc., etc. But the point I want to make, there's no point to always treat the water up to potable water standards, to drinking water standards. No, if you reuse the water, treat it to the purpose that is needed for the treatment. So maybe there's only very little treatment needed for aquifer recharge, but there's much more treatment needed if you want to reuse it in industrial processes or even as drinking water. So treating it fit for purpose and then reusing it for whatever use we want. And this is an example for reusing it in agriculture. That's an example from Ghana, where this lady stands in front of her farm fields and reusing the wastewater from the urban area here enabled her to make a living. And on average, the farmers in this area make between $400 to $800 per farmer per year just by urban agriculture, all based on wastewater. That needs to be done in a safe way, that's for sure. But there are technologies and methods to do that in a controlled and safe way. And my last point is, after we cannot reuse the water, we have to recover useful byproducts of the water. Wastewater has a lot of nutrients like potassium and phosphorus and nitrogen, which can be used as fertilizer. Thus we should try to recapture. And also, for instance, phosphorus can be relatively easily recovered from wastewater, particularly from urine. Other interesting byproducts is the organic material in the wastewater, which can be used for renewable energy, or metals, particularly in industrial wastewater. Metals are there and can be used as well. So this recovering of the byproducts can also help to come up with economic models that support the wastewater treatment. Yeah, and I can expand more in the discussion if you want. But in a nutshell, we really have to see wastewater as a resource and not as a burden. And you see here these little pebbles in these hands are fertilizer. This is struvite, really only recovered from wastewater and used in agriculture. And this struvite, which usually participates in the pipes of the wastewater treatment, can now be used as a fertilizer for farmers. So you see it's a good example how wastewater is a resource. Any question from your side on the topics before I enter my last part of my presentation? Is it all clear? Yes, please. Well, yeah, it's always think globally and act locally, huh? That also applies here. And if we all do that, that would help. And water saving is, of course, in the household by having more efficient toilet flushing or eco-sanitation and showers, etc., etc. Though there you can help a little bit. But I think a lot of water you can actually save in the supermarket by buying products that are not so water intensive, or buy products that are from your region. For instance, here in Europe, I'm living now in Italy, and before I was living in Northern Europe, and you find, for instance, oranges from the Middle East, and they are irrigated with water resources that are very. There's a lot of tension around these water resources because people literally fighting about the water. And then if you take irrigated oranges because you feel the whole year you need oranges, and this is ecologically not okay, you know, then eat oranges when they are ripe, when the season, and then for the rest of the year you don't, or strawberries, etc., etc., or reducing your meat consumption, etc., etc. So there's many ways where you can actually save a lot of water in the supermarket through your consumption pattern. And if we all do that collectively, globally, this would really have an impact. I understand your personal frustration that you feel when I save a little water, that doesn't mean much for the world. But if we all live the example and live that to our children, then collectively we will make a change. Okay. Then let me. There's another question. Yes, please. Hmm. Well, that's a very good question, and I wish I have the perfect answer, but I have to admit I don't. It's probably a mixture between better regulations, better policies, and if people don't follow them, then they have to be punished. You know, if they waste too much water, they feel it. And one thing is pricing. You know, just pricing the water right triggers already economic behavior. In many countries, for instance, irrigation water is for free. No, they just pay the gasoline for the pump. Yeah, they just take the water out of the groundwater of the river and without paying for it. And this doesn't facilitate an economic use. But if you have to pay for every cubic meter, then you're very careful. You know, you don't waste water because you become economically. And therefore proper pricing is maybe one part of that answer. Yeah. But I think that question was a good introduction to the last part, and it's called creating an enabling environment for change. I would like now to discuss in the remaining 5 to 10 minutes or 10 minutes here with you what do we need to actually change, and maybe the gentleman who was asking the question wants to comment on this at the end. So the first is having suitable legislation, you know, a regulatory framework that really facilitates the wastewater management. And for instance, sometimes Arab countries have been criticized for saying, you're not very efficient and so, but mind you that 11 out of 22 Arab states have actually a legislation that is permitting the use of treated wastewater. Yeah? So there's some improvements, but also places like Jordan is one of the countries that has the highest percentage of reuse of wastewater in agriculture. Yeah? So it's not necessarily the developed countries who are performing best here. But having the right legislation in place is, of course, the first very important thing. Second, appropriate financing and cost recovery. And we have to see if it is a resource, our wastewater, then we also have to factor that into our economic models. For this example with the phosphorus I showed you, at the one hand you reduce cost because the phosphorus doesn't make problems in the water distribution system, but on the other hand the phosphorus, the fertilizer, can also then be sold. So it's a revenue, and these kind of things have to be factored into the whole economic model of wastewater treatment, and that also has to be reflected in the financing then that is necessary. So really have a more integrated approach to financing and economics in wastewater management than just thinking about the costs. Yeah. Also, there's many publications that actually demonstrate that every investment in wastewater treatment pays back for the society very highly. You know, UNICEF has numbers that every dollar in sanitation pays back for society with a factor 5. So that's a good investment for an economy. Yeah. Number 3, for change, we have to minimize the risks. Wastewater has a bad reputation because of the health implication it can have. And I'm not only meaning that these ladies who are irrigating rice here, that they are not exposed to the wastewater directly. That's one field of contamination and also of unsafe reuse. Therefore, treatment is very important. But it's also, there is kind of systems nowadays that minimize the risk through the whole chain, during the generation of the wastewater, during the irrigation, for instance, but also during the food harvesting, processing, and so on, that you really minimize that the people are exposed to the risks related to wastewater. So minimum to the bacteria. Yeah. And we also see that especially the women and children actually who are exposed the most to the wastewater risks. Number 4, we believe what is very important is capacity building and knowledge. That means all the technology, for instance, that has been developed already is often not used. And it's often not used because our lack of capacity to use it properly. And a lot of wastewater treatment could also be done already with the technology and knowledge that we have now. But to be able to actually utilize this knowledge, it needs much more capacity building across levels. And my last point for an enabling environment for change is actually awareness raising and building acceptance with the people. If people don't know, then they don't act. I hope at the end of this lecture you felt like, oh man, he had an interesting story about wastewater. I think about the way I generate wastewater, the way I can actually avoid it or reduce the bad chemicals that I sometimes discharge with the wastewater. And so it starts with public acceptance and awareness. People need to know and need to be informed, and only then they can also act on it. And therefore, I hope you can see this movie. Can you see this astronaut playing with water? Is it visible to you? Yeah. So what you see here is an astronaut from the International Spaceship. That's the ISS. He has a drop of water in his hand, and he was taking out of this plastic, and now he's washing his hands, and now he's drying his hands. And what you see on this spaceship, this is a closed system, like System Earth, you know. And all the water that is on this spaceship, and this is there since the 2000s, in 17 years, the ISS is circulating around the globe. So since 17 years, this water is there. There's no rainfall in this spaceship. There's no groundwater body or whatever. All the water that is there has been brought there. All the food they eat is dehydrated, and they put water into this and that they can digest the food. And there's a constant recycling. So maybe the water in the morning they were drinking it as tea. In the afternoon it becomes pee, and in the evening they use it to brush the teeth. So you can see it's a constant recycling and reuse again and again. And there's no astronaut ever who became sick of this, you know. So technology is possible, but maybe this little video sticks to you, and you realize that it has a lot to do with acceptance and awareness. And in some places like San Diego or in Singapore, where wastewater reuse is practiced a lot, as much as they invest in technology and in systems, they also invest a lot in visitor centers and awareness raising campaigns, public information, etc., because this is very important for people to buy in and actually use this water safely. And that's what we call the so-called yuck factor. The yuck factor is the, I don't want that. Wastewater is something terrible. But I think maybe this little example from the astronaut convinces you that the yuck factor is to overcome. And in many places around the world, there's no other choice. And maybe one gentleman asked a question from Sao Paulo, and maybe also public awareness and acceptance is one of the key components in terms of investments to mitigate the water crisis, also in places like Sao Paulo. Let me finish this up. I hope over the last 45 minutes I was able to explain to you that wastewater is increasing worldwide. The vast majority, more than 80%, is actually without proper treatment released back to the environment. There's a lot of low-cost, affordable low-cost technology out there already. Question is to implement that. And if we do this, then we have to see that wastewater is a reliable source of water. And particularly, you're discussing climate change this week. To offset the impacts of water scarcity, wastewater is one of the resources that you should consider. It has interesting byproducts, things like energy, nutrients, recoverable byproducts we should utilize. And therefore, I think it is a very central component of the circular economy. Remember my early slides when I introduced the circular economy concept, which I believe water and wastewater is a very central component to that circular economy. Yeah. Number 7, wastewater treatment needs investments without question, but usually these financing, this investments that are needed is usually outweighed by the benefits. Particularly if you not only look at the benefits directly, what you do with the water directly, but if you look at the wider benefits for society, for the health, for the job creation, for the environmental sustainability, etc., it really outperforms the investments needed. And therefore, I believe it is a very essential component for the 2030 agenda. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to close my little lecture, and I encourage you to download our report, and it's, I think, uploaded already to your system, but you'll find all this and further information also in many different languages, including Portuguese and Spanish, at our website. Thank you so much for your attention. You have further questions?
Good morning, Professor. I have a question. What is the effect or the impact for marine litter in this topic?
Excuse me, can you repeat the question closer to the microphone? I can't understand you. Sorry.
What is the effect or the impact of the marine litter in this topic?
What is the effect or impact of
the marine litter in this topic?
Maybe
marine
somebody
rabies?
else.
No, marine litter. Basura marina.
Sea level rise. Oh, okay. That's difficult. That link is very difficult. Sea level rise is a very specific threat to coastal regions and therefore has many implications. Better wastewater treatment is very important for coastal regions, also for coral reefs, for habitats for fish, etc., etc. So there's many environmental implications that also have economic implications, but the sea level rise linkage is not so direct.
Hi, Professor. Good morning. Thank you so much for the presentation. As you said before, one of the recommendations to reduce our water footprint is reduce meat consumption. But what happens in the regions where agriculture and livestock production depends mostly on rain? What's the importance to reduce our green water footprint?
Well, if you have rain-fed agriculture, the water footprint is of course different from irrigated agriculture. In rain-fed agriculture, it depends what would be the natural vegetation there and what is the vegetation that you put there as a farmer. And if that vegetation needs more or less water, it can be that naturally would be a semi-arid area with some bushes, or where some water would be left for groundwater recharge or for downstream water uses. But you put, for instance, a very demanding crop or put eucalyptus forest, which transpires a lot of water, and then basically no water is left for groundwater recharge, no water is left for the in-stream ecology, for the rivers. and then the impact is larger. So I can't say that in so general terms. It really depends on what kind of agricultural products you produce there and what would be the natural vegetation. And the difference between this makes the water quantity impact to the environment.
And hi, teacher. My question is about technology in poor countries. I think that technology can't be the only solution because there are many countries with a lot of people who cannot pay for that technology for the treatment or to manage water. What do you think is the solution for that countries with a lot of people who has poverty?
Well, technology is very important and has a role to play. But I hope I was able to also explain that it's not only about new technology. It's largely about also implementing existing technology, having the right financial and other capacities to actually do this, which is has a lot to do with awareness raising and capacity building as well. But technology is very, very important, certainly for poor countries. Yeah. But also in water scarce poor countries, you see a lot of waste of water. So better awareness of the people, better managing at local level can already help a lot. We call that water demand management. And that can also really increase already the water availability. But technology, without doubt, has a very important role to play. Yeah? Other questions?
Hello. Hi, Professor. Good morning. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I think you outlined very well the problems and the solutions, especially on many scales. But I'm curious what kind of success you think these solutions may have. Like, for instance, you mentioned water pricing is a big issue. We do not price water at the value that it has, right? At what you work at very global scales. Is there success in different countries in changing pricing structures and working with governments to actually enact these changes that you've outlined? It seems like they're all good ideas, but to what extent are they being implemented?
Excellent question. Difficult to say, and I'm sure it varies a lot. Part of my job is also to inform policymakers about these things. Therefore, I showed this picture from the launch where we were presenting this in South Africa to political leaders. Last month, I was giving a presentation at the European Parliament on exactly the same topic. So we are very busy with not only having good ideas, but really working with policy and decision makers to actually implement these ideas. And that's one thing. How much this is always done in practice varies a lot. But I need to say, like, for instance, that in countries like Jordan, where it's one of the low-developed countries, low-income countries, yeah? But there is a very high percentage of wastewater from agriculture that is reused for not only wastewater from agriculture, general wastewater from municipal, industry, or agricultural wastewater. A very high percentage is reused already for agriculture because the need is so large there. So you can see in some countries they are taking it up, and it's not necessarily the rich countries. So it's the countries where the need is the largest. But I still believe there's still a huge progress we can make, and one of this is kind of sharing this knowledge, trying to influence policy making, that the policies go the right direction, and then assist with the necessary technology and other capacities that need to be built. So it varies a lot. I can't give you an accurate answer, but I try to explain a little bit how much it varies. Huh?
Thank you, Professor. My question is on wastewater discharge. Especially, I'm going to talk about the experience in sub-Saharan Africa, where multi-companies, multi-corporations have a tendency of investing in businesses which are relying on a lot of water production. I will give one example, for example, like Coca-Cola. It's one of the companies, 100% of their products are water-based. But they are not doing bad anyway, because they are even investing in watershed management and generally water management. They are doing well. However, there are those other corporations which are not bothering at all. And this is where my question comes to you. Who is doing global monitoring on water waste discharge? So, because there is need for control, there is a lot of mess when it comes to discharging waste, and it's being done in freshwater bodies. So, is there anybody responsible monitoring this discharge? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Very good question. I think the answer is no. The monitoring responsibility and also the right is certainly with the countries. I'm working for UNESCO, the United Nations, and we have maybe the mandate to observe this and to study this and to share the knowledge, but at the end the monitoring is with the countries. Also for the Sustainable Development Goals, I showed this goal 6.3, which has a target directly formulated for wastewater treatment. But to monitor this really needs countries buying into that and actually make the investment and actually do it. And I strongly believe this is a very good investment in case you become the next water minister of sub-Saharan African country. So I really hope that you put your resources in monitoring, because only things that are measured can be managed. And if things that are not measured, they're much more unlikely to get done. So only if you measure things and if you try to manage things, then they get done. So I believe that monitoring is one of the key things. Often during my presentation, I gave like more than 80% of these type of values because we don't know better. We were really in trouble to find reliable data, and we only depend on data that we find. We cannot measure this ourselves. And so monitoring is one of the key things which I want you to consider for future investments. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. My question was also related to the pricing water. I want to know if the data and the United Nations, or they're considering the virtual water, because the treaties and the World Trade Organization, they don't consider, and the WTO, their policy is reduction of tariffs of agricultural products. So the virtual water is based not regulated in any treaties or the products that are coming from agricultural countries to the others, and the pricing is getting lower, and they don't consider this virtual water.
I hope I understood your question. You ask about if virtual water is considered. Is that the question?
Yeah, it's not considered in the pricing of the water. If you see any data, if it's considered in the data and the research when they see the management of the wastewater.
I think it's not considered. You're right. So it's also a difficult concept, but usually it's not considered. We work with data directly. Of course, sometimes we find publications on virtual water where people quantify that, and we refer to them and use these numbers. But usually we talk about the direct water fluxes, not the virtual water fluxes. But I fully agree with you how important they are. The T-shirt I'm wearing probably needed 2,000 to 3,000 liters of water to produce this T-shirt. So it's not. It's really the virtual water backpack, that every good has. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Professor, as the water scarcity increases, water transfer projects are also being taken into account in some regions. In Brazil, there is a huge one going on right now. It's São Francisco. a water transfer project, and I know it's a very complex subject, but I would like to listen your opinion on that, your view on that. Thank you.
Oh wow, I'm not knowledgeable about the details, so I have to be very careful what I say, because you have excellent hydrologists in Brazil, and it would be pleasure to work with them. But from the little I know, I found it very difficult to come up with a clear statement. But overall, we have to understand that water transfer projects are very, very costly. Costly in terms of investments for infrastructure, but also costly for the environment, etc. So before you do this, you should first prevent the problem. So trying to optimize the water use efficiencies, and then maybe less water transfer schemes or smaller transfer schemes, more water for the environment is left, etc. is possible. So therefore, before investing in these things, you have to look at the whole package. What are the other possibilities to save water and utilize resources like wastewater that are usually not utilized? A large part of the wastewater in Brazil is discharged to the environment without any treatment. So if you reuse all this water, you might design the water reuse, the transfer scheme much smaller. So these are things that should be part of the equation, but usually forgotten. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Stefan, thank you very much indeed for your enlightening talking. And I'm sure that the audience has appreciated that. Thank you for your time to be with us, and hopefully I can see you here at USP when you are going to Brasilia next year.
Yeah.
You are already invited to come here and give another talk for us. Okay? And
thank you.
Applause for the Professor Stefan. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
See you in Brasilia. Bye.
Thank you. Success with your seminar, and I'm looking forward to see you in Brazil one day. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.